descending the river. The next morning it was close at hand, and the citizens mounting the walls beheld with consternation the approaching armament. So numerous were the ships that they completely covered the river. The fleet consisted of 700 sailing ships and a vastly greater number of rowing galleys and boats. These vessels were crowded with men, and their fierce aspect, their glittering arms, and their lofty stature spread terror in the hearts of the citizens. "This is truly a tremendous host," the Count Eudes said to Edmund, who stood beside him on the walls. "It is indeed," Edmund replied. "Numerous as are the fleets which have poured down upon the shores of England, methinks that none approaches this in strength. It is clear that Northmen have united their forces for a great effort against this city, but having at home successfully defended fortifications, which were not to be named in comparison with those of Paris, against them, I see no reason to doubt that we shall be able to beat them off here." The Danes landed on the opposite bank and formed a vast camp there, and the following morning 3 of their number in a small boat rowed across the river, and said that their king, Siegfroi, desired to speak with Goslin, Archbishop of Paris, who stood in the position of civil governor. They were told that the archbishop would receive the king in his palace. An hour later a stately figure in glittering armour was seen to take his place in a long galley, which, rowed by 20 men, quickly shot across the stream. Siegfroi landed, and, accompanied by 4 of his leading warriors, entered the gates, which were opened at his approach. The chief of the Northmen was a warrior of lofty stature. On his head he wore a helmet of gold, on whose crest was a raven with extended wings wrought in the same metal. His hair fell loosely on his neck. His face was clean shaved in the Danish fashion, save for a long moustache. He wore a breastplate of golden scales, and carried a shield of the toughest bull's hide, studded with gold nails. He was unarmed, save for a long dagger which he wore in his belt. He and his followers, who were all men of immense stature, walked with a proud and assured air between the lines of citizens, who clustered thickly on each side of the street, and who gazed in silence at these dreaded figures. They were escorted by the chamberlain of the archbishop, and on arriving at his palace were conducted into the chamber where Goslin, Count Eudes, and several of the leading persons of Paris awaited them. Siegfroi bent his head before the prelate. "Goslin," he said, "I beg you to have compassion upon yourself and your flock if you do not wish to perish. We beseech you to turn a favourable ear to our words. Grant only that we shall march through the city. We will touch nothing in the town, and we undertake to preserve all your property, both yours and that of Eudes." The archbishop replied at once. "This city has been confided to us by the Emperor Charles, who is, after God, the king and master of the powers of the earth. Holding under his rule almost all the world, he confided it to us with the assurance that we should suffer no harm to come to the kingdom, but should keep it for him safe and sure. If it had happened that the defence of these walls had been committed to your hands, as it has been committed to mine, what would you have done had such a demand been made upon you? Would you have granted the demand?" "If I had granted it," Siegfroi replied, "may my head fall under the axe and serve as food for dogs. Nevertheless, if you do not grant our demands, by day we will overwhelm your city with our darts, and with poisoned arrows by night. You shall suffer all the horrors of hunger, and year after year we will return and make a ruin of your city." Without another word he turned, and, followed by his companions, strode through the streets of Paris, and, taking his place in the boat, returned to his camp. At daybreak the next morning the Norsemen were seen crowding into their ships. The trumpets sounded loudly, and the citizens seized their arms and hastened to the walls. The Norsemen crossed the river and directed their attack against a tower which stood at the head of the bridge connecting the city and island with the farther bank. Those who landed were provided with picks, crowbars, and other implements for effecting a breach, and their approach was protected by a cloud of arrows and javelins from the fleet which covered the surface of the river. The French leaders soon assembled at the threatened point. Chief among these were Eudes, his brother Robert, the Count Ragnar, and the Abbé Ible, a nephew of the archbishop. The Franks bore themselves bravely, and in spite of the rain of arrows defended the wall against the desperate attack of the Norsemen. The fortifications in those days were very far from having attained the strength and solidity which a few generations later were bestowed upon them. The stones of which they were constructed were comparatively small, and fastened together by mortar, consequently they could ill resist even an assault by manual weapons. Covered by their shields, the Northmen worked untiringly at the foundations, and piece by piece the walls crumbled to the ground. Every effort, however, to enter at the breaches so made was repulsed, and Siegfroi kept back his warriors, determined to delay the grand assault until the next day. By nightfall the tower was in ruins. Scarcely a portion of the walls remained erect. Many of the besieged had been killed. The archbishop was wounded with an arrow. Frederick, a young soldier who led the troops of the church, was killed. The besiegers, unfortunately, had suffered much more severely, great numbers having been killed by the stones and missiles hurled down by the defenders while engaged in the demolition of the walls. At nightfall the Danes carried off their wounded and recrossed the river, confident that next day they would succeed in their assault. As soon as darkness had set in, Count Eudes collected the citizens, and these, bearing beams and planks, crossed the bridge to the tower and set to work. Outside the circle of ruins holes were dug and the beams securely fixed. Planks were nailed to these, and earth heaped up behind them. All night the work continued, and by morning a fortification much higher than the original tower had been erected all round the ruin. The Danes again crossed the river in their ships, and the assault was renewed. Javelins and great stones were hurled at the fortification, and clouds of arrows from the shipping fell within them. Covered with portable roofs constructed of planks, the Danes strove to destroy the wall. The besieged poured upon them a blazing mixture of oil, wax, and pitch. Numbers of the Danes were burned to death, while others, maddened by the pain, threw themselves into the river. Over and over again Siegfroi led his warriors to the attack, but the defenders, headed by Eudes and the brave Abbe Ebble, each time repelled them. The Abbe particularly distinguished himself, and he is reported to have slain 7 Danes at once with one javelin, a blow which may be considered as bordering on the miraculous. But the number of the defenders of the town was small indeed to that of the enemy, and the loss which they inflicted upon the Danes, great as it was as nothing in so vast a host. The flames of the machines, lighted by the pitch and oil, communicated to the planks of the fortification, and soon these too were on fire. As they burned, the earth behind them gave way, and a breach was formed. Encouraged by this result, the Danes brought up faggots, and in several places lighted great fires against the fortifications. The defenders began to lose all hope, when a tremendous storm of rain suddenly burst over Paris, quenching the fire. The besieged gained heart, reinforcements crossed from the town, and the Danes again withdrew to their ships, having lost in the day's fighting 300 men. After this repulse the Northmen desisted for a time from their attack. They formed a strong fortified camp near the church of Saint Germain, and then spread over the country, slaying and burning, sparing none, man, woman, or child. From the walls of Paris the smoke could be seen rising over the whole country, and every heart was moved with rage and sorrow. Edmund and his party had taken no part in the defence of the tower. Its loss would not have involved that of the town, and Eudes requested him to keep his band in reserve, in order that they might remain intact until the Danes should make a breach in the walls of the city itself, when the sudden reinforcement of a party of such well-trained warriors might decide the result. While a portion of the Danish host were engaged upon the work of devastation, a large number were employed upon the construction of 3 great towers. These were built on wheels, and were each large enough to hold 60 men. They far overtopped the walls, and the citizens viewed with alarm the time when an assault should be delivered under the protection of these formidable machines. 18 ships of equal size were moored by the bank, 6 deep. Great planks were laid across them, and a sloping platform having been formed, the towers were, by the efforts of thousands of men, moved up and placed on the ships. "If we do not destroy those towers, Egbert," Edmund said one day as he saw them slowly moving into their position on board the ships, "all is lost, for from their summits the Northmen with their bows and javelins will be able to clear the walls, while those below effect a breach at their leisure." "That is true enough, Edmund, but I do not see any way to destroy them. Unfortunately we have no boats, or we might fill some of them with combustibles and tow them down until near enough for the stream to carry them upon these vessels, but even then the chance was small indeed, for the Danes would swarm out in their boats and manage to tow or push them so that they would not touch the ships. I should think, Egbert, that if we could get some skins or planks we and our band might, when it was quite dark, sally out and take to the water at the lower end of the island, and float down.